It's funny how one quiet night and a cracked door can unravel a decade of supposed happiness. You think you know someone until you're accidentally gifted the truth in surround sound. Turns out, lies echo louder than laughter, especially when they're whispered. My name's Phineas, and until a few weeks ago, I thought I had my life figured out. I wasn't living a fairy tale, but I didn't need one. I had Eleanor, my wife of 10 years, and together we had what I used to call practical happiness. You know the kind: steady jobs, a comfortable home, and a shared disdain for overly enthusiastic neighbors who treated every holiday like the Olympics of lawn decor. Eleanor was everything I admired in a partner. Intelligent, driven, with just the right amount of sharp wit to keep me on my toes. Her laugh could light up a room, until it started to sound rehearsed. It wasn't immediate, the change. It crept in, subtle as shadows at dusk. First, it was the way she seemed distracted during conversations, her attention darting to her phone every few minutes. Then, the late nights at the gallery became more frequent, always with a perfectly reasonable excuse. There's a new shipment, we're reorganizing, or you know how it is with these events. And I believed her, because why wouldn't I? But trust, as I've since learned, is a fragile thing. It feels solid until you realize it's built on assumptions, not facts. That Tuesday night was ordinary in every way that mattered. I'd come home from work, reheated leftovers, and spent the evening scrolling mindlessly on my phone while Eleanor was, as usual, working late. She came home around 9:30, breezing past me with a kiss on the cheek that felt more habit than affection. She grabbed a glass of wine and disappeared into her study. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't until later, as I lay in bed struggling to fall asleep, that I heard it, faint murmurs drifting up the staircase. It was coming from Eleanor's study, the door left slightly ajar. At first, I assumed she was on a call with Serafina, her best friend. Their late-night phone marathons were nothing new. But the tone of her voice was different, lower, almost conspiratorial. I couldn't make out the words, but something about it prickled the back of my neck. Curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and crept toward the source of the voice. As I reached the top of the stairs, I could hear Eleanor more clearly. "He doesn't suspect anything," she whispered. I froze. My mind scrambled to process the meaning of those words. He? Who was she talking about? And what didn't I suspect? The rest of the conversation was muffled, and I couldn't bring myself to move closer. I stood there in the dark, my heart pounding in my chest, 1,000 possibilities swirling in my head. For the first time in a decade, I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. When the murmuring stopped, I quickly retreated to the bedroom, pretending to be asleep when Eleanor returned moments later. She slipped into bed beside me, her breathing steady, as though nothing had happened. But for me, everything had changed. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that my world had just shifted in a way I didn't yet understand. The morning after was the first time I realized how thoroughly trust can warp perception. Eleanor moved through our kitchen as if nothing had changed, humming a tune under her breath as she prepared coffee. She asked me about my day ahead, her voice light, her smile effortless. I responded in kind, feigning my usual casualness, but the words from last night hung over me like a dark cloud. He doesn't suspect anything. It took everything in me to not demand answers right there, but instead, I nodded along and let her prattle on about her plans. Something inside me told me I needed to tread carefully. I needed more than suspicion. So, I did what I've never done in the entirety of our marriage. I paid attention. Eleanor's schedule, once something I barely noticed, became a puzzle I couldn't stop trying to solve. She left earlier for work than usual that day, claiming she had an important meeting with the gallery owner. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice, but now every detail felt like a clue. Her voice, her expressions, the subtle way she hesitated when I asked if she'd be home for dinner. It all seemed like pieces to a larger, darker picture. I decided to follow her. It felt ridiculous at first. Who was I to play amateur detective, shadowing my own wife like some noir protagonist? But curiosity had turned into something more potent, a need. I couldn't keep sitting in ignorance while Eleanor's whispers replayed in my mind. I left work an hour early, parked a block away from the gallery, and waited. For a while, it was uneventful, just another ordinary day, or so it seemed. I watched staff come and go, familiar faces carrying art supplies or chatting on their phones. And then Eleanor emerged, her face alight with an energy I hadn't seen in months. She wasn't alone. The man with her was tall, sharply dressed, with an easy confidence in the way he moved. He laughed at something she said, his hand brushing her arm as they walked. My stomach churned at the sight. Was this him? The he from the whispers? I followed them to a nearby cafe, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. They sat outside, their conversation animated, their body language betraying an intimacy that felt wrong. I couldn't hear their words, but I didn't need to. The way she leaned toward him, the way he mirrored her movements, it told me everything I didn't want to know. As I watched from across the street, my phone buzzed. It was Eleanor, texting me a simple, "How's your day going?" The irony was almost laughable. My day? Well, it was unraveling faster than a poorly knitted sweater. I didn't reply. Instead, I took a photo. One click, just enough to capture the scene, to preserve the moment that would later confirm my worst fears. That evening, Eleanor returned home as if nothing had happened. She kissed my cheek, asked me how my day was, and even laughed at a joke I made about our neighbor's hideous garden gnome. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I was wrong, that I'd misunderstood what I saw, that her whispers weren't what I thought they were. But then, as she turned away to pour herself a glass of wine, I noticed something. Her phone buzzed, and for a brief second, I glimpsed the name on the screen, Isaiah. She didn't pick it up immediately, but the way her fingers hovered over the glass, the way she bit her lip, small, almost imperceptible gestures, told me everything I needed to know. I knew then this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was betrayal. Revenge isn't just an act, it's a process. And if you rush it, you lose its potency. I knew that the moment I decided Eleanor would feel the full weight of her betrayal. The plan had to be meticulous, a slow burn that would ignite at just the right moment. I wasn't just looking to confront her. I wanted to dismantle her carefully constructed life piece by piece. This was going to be her undoing, and it had to be perfect. It started with the party. Eleanor's birthday was weeks away, and she had already been dropping not-so-subtle hints about wanting a big celebration. Normally, I would have shrugged it off or booked a simple dinner reservation. But this year, I insisted we go all out. A grand gathering, hosted in her honor, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues. She practically lit up at the suggestion, throwing herself into the planning while gushing about how thoughtful I was. She had no idea. Every decision I made in those weeks was deliberate. I took control of the guest list, suggesting we invite her gallery team, close friends, and family members who adored her. Most importantly, I made sure Isaiah was included. "It's only right," I'd said with a casual smile, "since he's been such a big part of your work life this year." The irony was almost delicious. Then came the venue. I chose a private event space downtown, a sleek, modern loft with floor-to-ceiling windows and just the right level of elegance to stroke Eleanor's ego. It would be a stage, not just for her, but for the spectacle I was crafting. She spent hours deliberating over menus and decorations, while I quietly ensured everything would play into my larger scheme. Meanwhile, I gathered my evidence. The letters, the photos, the messages, they were all there, but I needed more. Something undeniable. I installed a discreet recording device in her car, catching snippets of her phone conversations with Isaiah. Most were mundane, discussing work or gallery acquisitions, but every now and then, she let her guard down. "I can't wait to see you," she said once, her voice warm in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Phineas won't suspect a thing." Those words were all I needed. In the evenings, when Eleanor was preoccupied with party planning or late-night meetings, I created the centerpiece of my plan, a slideshow. It began innocently enough, photos of us from vacations, anniversaries, and quiet moments at home. But halfway through it shifted. The images of us faded into photos of her and Isaiah. At the cafe, at the park, outside his apartment. Messages appeared on the screen, damning in their casual intimacy. And then, to cap it off, a recording of her laugh as she mocked me to him. It wasn't enough to shock her. I wanted her to feel the walls of her carefully curated life closing in, the weight of every lie crushing her in front of the people she wanted to impress most. This wasn't just revenge, it was a reckoning. The days leading up to the party were almost surreal. Eleanor flitted around the house, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beneath her feet. She complimented me on my enthusiasm for the celebration, joking that it was almost suspicious how invested I was. I smiled, kissed her on the forehead, and told her she deserved it. Every moment felt like a lie, but I clung to the thought of what was coming. There was one moment that almost unraveled me. 2 nights before the party, Eleanor caught me staring at her across the dinner table, my mind 1,000 miles away. "What's that look for?" she asked, laughing softly. For a split second, I considered telling her everything right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled and said, "Just thinking about how lucky I am." She reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me," she said. The irony of it nearly made me choke. By the time the party rolled around, every piece was in place. The guest list was finalized, the slideshow was ready, and Isaiah had confirmed his attendance with a polite, oblivious RSVP. Eleanor's betrayal was a masterpiece of deception, but my revenge was shaping up to be a work of art. The stage was set. All that was left was to light the match. The loft was alive with the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. Eleanor, radiant and charming as ever, moved through the room like a queen holding court. Her laughter rang out, light and carefree, completely unaware of the reckoning that loomed. I stood to the side, my smile fixed and unreadable, watching the woman I once adored bask in the glow of her carefully crafted life. Tonight it would all crumble. The first half of the evening went according to her expectations. Guests mingled, offering toasts to her brilliance and wishing her well for the year ahead. Eleanor lapped up the praise, every compliment feeding her ego. Even Isaiah, standing quietly in the corner, caught her eye more than once. I noticed the way she blushed slightly when their gazes met, a flicker of intimacy they foolishly believed no one else could see. Perfect. At 8:30, I tapped my glass, the delicate sound cutting through the chatter. The room quieted as I stepped forward, feigning a nervous chuckle. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, letting my voice tremble just enough to sell the moment. "This evening is about Eleanor, a celebration of her brilliance, her dedication, and the incredible person we all admire." The crowd applauded politely, Eleanor beaming as if she'd won an award. "I've prepared something special to honor her," I continued, gesturing toward the large screen at the front of the room. "A little tribute to the life we've built together and the journey we've shared." Eleanor's eyes widened with delight, and she reached out to squeeze my hand. "You're too sweet," she whispered, her voice dripping with gratitude. I nodded, my smile tight. "Anything for you." The slideshow began with the predictable fare: photos of vacations, holidays, and anniversaries. Eleanor glanced at me, her eyes shining with what she must have thought was love. She had no idea what was coming. Then the tone shifted. The first new image was subtle. Eleanor and Isaiah sitting at the cafe, her hand resting lightly on his. A ripple of confusion ran through the room, but I kept my expression neutral, allowing the gravity of the photo to sink in. The next image wasn't so subtle. Eleanor and Isaiah at the park, his hand resting possessively on her lower back. Murmurs began to spread among the guests, the tension thickening as the photos became more damning. A screenshot of their text messages followed, displayed in bold clarity for all to see. "Isaiah, can't wait to see you tonight. You looked amazing this morning." Eleanor, "Stop, you'll make me blush." "Phineas is working late, so come over whenever you want." Gasps erupted from the crowd, Eleanor's face draining of color as she stumbled backward, her composure unraveling before my eyes. "Phineas," she hissed, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" I ignored her, clicking to the next slide, a video. Her laugh filled the room, casual and cutting. "Phineas is so oblivious. It's almost cute." The room fell deathly silent, the weight of her betrayal hanging heavy in the air. Isaiah, who had been trying to blend into the background, shifted uncomfortably as all eyes turned toward him. I let the silence stretch, savoring the moment before delivering the final blow. I thought this evening was about celebrating Eleanor, I said, my voice calm but sharp. And I suppose, in a way, it is. Tonight we celebrate the truth. Eleanor has been lying to me, to all of us, for months. Isaiah, I gestured toward him. You've been quite the guest of honor in her life, haven't you? Eleanor stammered, her words jumbled and desperate. Phineas, I can explain. It's not what it looks like. I turned to her, my smile cold. You're right. It's worse. The crowd erupted, a mix of shock, outrage, and disbelief. Eleanor's mother sank into a chair, her hands covering her face, while her colleagues whispered furiously amongst themselves. Isaiah attempted to slip out unnoticed, but I stopped him with a single word. Leaving so soon? He froze, his face pale, before muttering an excuse and bolting for the door. Eleanor, now trembling, reached for me, but I stepped back, my voice rising above the chaos. Eleanor, this is what you've built, a life of lies. Enjoy it. I turned and walked out, leaving her alone to face the wreckage. Outside, the night was cool and still, the quiet a sharp contrast to the storm I'd left behind. I didn't look back. The party ended, but the echoes of that night lingered in Eleanor's life like the aftermath of a firestorm. By the time I stepped out of the loft and into the cool night air, I knew her world was already beginning to collapse. The mask she had worn so expertly for months had shattered, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. When I got home, I sat on the couch in the silence, letting the reality settle in. It wasn't triumph I felt, more like a strange, hollow calm. The kind you get when a storm has passed, and you're left surveying the wreckage. My phone buzzed with notifications, a steady stream of messages from party guests, most of them expressing shock, sympathy, or barely concealed schadenfreude. The one that stood out was from Eleanor's mother. I had no idea. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. I didn't respond. What was there to say? She wasn't the one who needed to apologize. The first blow came the morning after the party. Eleanor's mother, Florence, had always been her biggest supporter, but even she had her limits. According to mutual friends, the confrontation between them was brutal. Florence demanded to know how Eleanor could humiliate not only me, but also the family. Eleanor's attempts at excuses, stress, mistakes, a moment of weakness, were met with icy disbelief. A moment of weakness doesn't last months, her mother reportedly snapped before leaving. Her friends were no kinder. Most of them sided with me, their loyalty shifting almost overnight. In their eyes, Eleanor had become a cautionary tale, a living, breathing example of how betrayal can destroy more than a marriage. A few reached out to me directly, offering their support and subtly distancing themselves from her. I had no idea she was capable of something like this, one friend wrote. You deserve so much better. At work, the fallout was even more devastating. Isaiah, spineless as ever, resigned from the gallery the day after the party, leaving Eleanor to face the consequences alone. Gossip spread like wildfire through her office, with whispers of the affair becoming the centerpiece of every coffee break. Her boss, who had attended the party, called her into his office for a discussion about professionalism. By the end of the week, she had been encouraged to resign, her reputation too tarnished to salvage. The aftermath among our family and friends was just as chaotic. My parents were supportive, but furious on my behalf. My mother, a woman who rarely minced words, called Eleanor directly to tell her exactly what she thought. You had everything, and you threw it away, she said. I don't even recognize the person I once trusted with my son. Eleanor's brother, Marcus, was equally unforgiving. You've embarrassed all of us, he told her in a scathing email that he later forwarded to me. If you think anyone's going to take your side in this, you're delusional. But the harshest reaction came from Eleanor's closest friend, Serafina. She had been one of the loudest voices cheering Eleanor on during her career highs, but even she couldn't excuse the betrayal. I defended you for years, Serafina wrote in a blistering message. I vouched for you, celebrated you, and you repay me by making me complicit in your lies? Don't contact me again. Eleanor called me 3 days after the party. Her voice was shaky raw. Phineas, please, just let me explain. But I had no interest in explanations. I let her talk, though I barely listened. She rambled about how she never meant to hurt me, how she'd been lost, how Isaiah had been a mistake. It was almost impressive the way she managed to paint herself as both the victim and the hero of her own tragedy. When she finally stopped, I simply said, "You made your choices, Eleanor. Now you live with them." That was the last time we spoke. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor's life continued to unravel. She moved out of our house, staying temporarily with a distant cousin who seemed more interested in the drama than offering genuine support. Her social media accounts, once filled with curated images of her perfect life, went dark. And while I never saw her directly, mutual friends reported that she looked diminished, smaller somehow, like the weight of her choices had finally caught up to her. As for me, I began to rebuild, slowly, cautiously, but with a newfound sense of clarity. I realized that the Eleanor I had loved no longer existed, or perhaps she never had. Either way, I was free to start over, to redefine what happiness meant, and to leave the wreckage of our marriage behind. Eleanor had always been the star of her own show, but in the end, it was her downfall that everyone remembered. And while I wouldn't say I came out unscathed, I came out stronger. Sometimes, that's the best revenge of all. The fallout from Eleanor's betrayal hit her like a tidal wave. In the days following the party, the texts, calls, and visits from friends and family weren't filled with concern. They were accusations, disappointment, and worst of all for Eleanor, silence. The people who once admired her now saw her for what she truly was, and they turned away. Eleanor's mother, Florence, was livid. "You've humiliated us," she told her over the phone, her voice cutting like a blade. Florence didn't mince words. She refused to defend her daughter, instead telling her to figure out her mess on her own. Eleanor's brother, Marcus, wasn't any kinder. "You've burned every bridge," he said. "Good luck finding anyone who trusts you now." Her friends, the ones who used to hang on her every word, abandoned her almost overnight. "I can't believe I defended you all these years," Serafina texted. It was the last message Eleanor received from her. Most of her friends quietly blocked her, avoiding the drama entirely. Her social circle, once vibrant and bustling, became a void. As for me, life began to feel lighter. The house was quiet, peaceful, and free of the tension I hadn't realized had been suffocating me for years. Friends and family rallied around me, offering support I didn't know I needed. It wasn't easy, but it was liberating. Eleanor had spent years building a life on lies, and it all came crashing down in a single night. She was left with the wreckage, while I finally found freedom. Sometimes, the harshest punishment isn't what you do to someone. It's letting them live with the consequences of their own choices.